Great, so this is a 15-20 minute masterclass on delivering on a B2B project. As Steve mentioned, my name is Daniel Walsh. I'm now the CTO of Monsoon Consulting. So I head up the development team, infrastructure team, and quality team at Monsoon. Over the last few years, I've been project delivery manager involved in all of the projects that you would have seen here today. Format of this session is very much, it's 8 keys to success when delivering on a B2B e-commerce platform. There's a lot to this. I could spend hours talking through how to actually work through these types of projects, but based on these projects that we've gone through, based on retrospectives from these projects, there's some useful stuff that's definitely worth noting. Cool, so to kick off, the first key I would see is aligning the business to the objectives of the project. And it was an interesting question earlier around maybe trying to build out a project from a particular department. We found that doesn't necessarily work as well. Usually you need sponsorship within a board of directors, within senior management, and there's a clear direction across departments, because these are transformational digital projects for a company, so it can't just be an isolation of one department. So the way we tackle this is through a project vision, a singular project vision. It's the very first workshop that we actually run. And the purpose of the vision is to align all departments, all key stakeholders to what the business is trying to achieve through this project. Usually this is effectively, it's an elevator pitch. This is, you're encapsulating what you're trying to achieve within one sentence, maybe 2 sentences. And then we use that as a filter mechanism, whereby when features, let's say, are requested during a discovery phase throughout the project, if they don't align to the vision, then do you need to kick these out of the project, kick them into a phase 2, kick them down the road. So a vision-led project is critical to success, I believe. The second one is stakeholder workshops. So there's a scoping exercise that will need to take place when building out a project and building out a spec. That's traditionally done through engaging stakeholders. There's lots of reasons why you should do this. Obviously, in a single department, a business analyst, or if it's the IT department, will have visibility from their perspective. They won't necessarily be sitting in the shoes of everyone else. So working through getting all the relevant stakeholders in the room, they then feel that they've bought into the process, so that they will back the process once you actually start development and once you push the product live. If you don't engage them, then they're going to be the dissenters on the outskirts that'll potentially throw stones. So it's important to engage them, even if it's a case of just engaging them to get buy-in, or if it's actual engagement to get to elicit requirements. The third one we found is steering group meetings. So it's not just engaging the stakeholders from the outset and then disappearing for 4, 6, 12 months. It's regular monthly updates, and usually we find having a steering group meeting with a representative from each department helps in those types of updates. The second thing is it's not just 2 parties involved. So obviously you have the client, the business themselves. They'll have their own project team. You'll have the solution implementer, and they'll have their project team. There might be other partners involved. You might be doing an ERP upgrade at the time. There might be a CRM project. So a steering group meeting is effectively all partners to this build, both primary or secondary partners that need to feed into the process and feed into the updates, so that everyone is heading in a clear direction throughout the build. So monthly steering group meetings are very worthwhile. So that's on the alignment side. The second piece we would look at is customer and user involvement. And interestingly, most of the conversations today have been about understanding the context, understanding the users. So research has cropped up time and time again. And this takes a number of forms, qualitative and quantitative research. So it can be as simple as putting out email marketing as a survey on the site to understand behavior. But then when you get to qualitative research, it's actually going on site, doing customer safaris, seeing how they're actually interacting, and that's to validate what you're finding from quantitative research. The second piece we would look at is is prototyping. In a traditional project, B2B project, you'll want to come up with a visual prototype that you'll want to put in front of customers before you actually start development. It's a lot easier to make changes at that point than when you start down the development process. So by prototyping early, by getting early user testing, you can get feedback immediately, and then don't stop there. You need to iterate. You need to go again, make changes based off what the users have said, and put it back in front of them again to see, have you unblocked something that maybe there was an assumption around why you put something in place. So I think the key for customer and user involvement is validating assumptions. There are so many assumptions made by the business on how they know their customers, and maybe by an agency in terms of how they know digital. But as Daniel talked about, the context, you need to validate all of those assumptions if you really want the project to succeed. And again, context. From a technology perspective, context is critical. And I'll give an example of the Brimec example, which would be the plumber who might realize when he's under a radiator that there's a particular bolt or nut that he's missing. He might not be online. So offline ordering might be a key requirement that would come from understanding the context of the user. And then if offline ordering is required, then that fundamentally changes the architecture. So it's very important both from an onboarding perspective, but also from an architecture perspective to understand the context of use. Third element I'd look at would be to be agile. It's around the scoping of the project. Of course, there's going to need to be, in the early stages of the project, a lot of work put into actually developing scope, developing the requirements, user stories that are to be delivered throughout the project. Again, we would tie it back to vision. So it's traditionally you're going to have a Moscow situation where there's the musts, shoulds, coulds, and won'ts. We would usually filter that by the vision. And again, pressure can come from senior management on, let's say, adding a feature just because they saw it on a competitor's website. While that's very intense pressure because it's coming from above, it still needs to be filtered by vision. If it's not going to help achieve the vision of the project, then what's the reason in doing it? You're going to spend budget on it. You might not get value from it. Identifying value is a key part of a scoping exercise. So traditionally, value will come in a number of forms. Increasing sales is the obvious one, increasing conversion rate. Decreasing costs from a B2B perspective is a huge part of a lot of B2B projects. Or at least decreasing cost to serve for that unit and then moving staff into different areas that can be of more business benefit. Identifying value can be, increasing the brand of the business with the actual target market as well. So once you identify value, I would look at it as almost value-based scoping. Is for each feature that is going to make the cut, where is the value? And you need to be able to either directly or indirectly tie value to that. Third piece would be the ability to adapt to change. You can have an exhaustive process up front to scope everything. That's not going to mean you're not going to identify something in the middle of the project that will require some level of a pivot. So the ability to be able to adapt to change, either by you user test a prototype and then you're surprised by the results that come back. Therefore, you might need to reprioritize the backlog based off that user research. So you need to build in change into the process. Nothing is ever concrete out of a discovery phase, and it's how you handle that change, and that is a key element. And Palace is a very interesting example where throughout the discovery process, it was identified that actually there was a pivot immediately needed before any development happened. Instead of delivering an ordering portal, it was phase one then turned to a click and collect portal. So again, yes, certainty is a key requirement, but also ability to handle change is also a key requirement. So it's a fine balance between the two. On the risk side, there's going to be risk in these projects. There's no getting away from that. So the key is to identify that risk as early as possible. You want to identify what the unknowns are that need to be tackled. So risk can take many forms. It can be, maybe there's a parallel project, upgrade project on an ERP or a CRM. Maybe there's new staff that don't understand the processes. Maybe you're not sure, is the product ready for customers? Maybe you need to actually put it out to test to even identify and justify that this is actually worth building. Maybe there's unknowns in an integration. So early on throughout a discovery phase, you want to identify where all the risk is. And then the second piece is you want to front load that risk into the early stages of the project. Early stages meaning it could be the early development sprints, or it could be a more fleshed out requirements stage. Effectively, these are the known unknowns, and by tackling those early, you're immediately de-risking the project. That's not to say there won't be unknowns, but it's a good risk mitigation strategy. The third area would be business processes. And as part of any requirements piece in scoping out a project, you're going to be understanding business process. If you're coming at it from the outside in, you might realize that it might be a nonsensical business process, it might be illogical, and codifying an illogical business process will result in illogical code. So you may need to actually re-engineer the process first before you start development. And then you're back to the cycle of change management. And again, these are internal processes and activities that might need to happen within your companies before you move into a development phase. It will happen. You're going to find stuff that might need to be re-engineered. So it's something worth considering. Fifth element is collaboration. And there's no getting away from the fact that there's going to be at least 2 project teams involved. So from our perspective as a solution implementer, we would have a dedicated project team on all of our projects. But on the client side, on your side, you will need a project team in some shape or form to be able to manage the actual delivery of this project. And what we find is they usually need to be dedicated in some shape or form. So in the last 3 to 4 project retrospectives that we've had, even outside of the ones that you've seen today, a key complaint of clients is that they didn't dedicate enough resources to the project. Typically speaking, it's a project manager that would need to be dedicated to it. It's going to be an analyst in some shape or form very early on if there's business process change. From a technical perspective, you need someone who understands the tech, who understands the data in particular. These projects, e-commerce platforms are usually very heavily integrated into backend systems. So you need someone who knows those systems inside out. If you don't have someone in those, and actually Unifar is a great example of that, because Unifar is just so big and SAP is just a monolith of a system, there was no single person that really understood that platform inside out. And that carried risk then into the project as a result. But dedication is crucial, and it's something that even when coming up with the business case to go to senior management in terms of costing a project, it's not just the actual dev costs for a solution implementer, it's how much time, how many resources you need to dedicate internally, and you're talking about salaries then, you're talking about the impact to business. But it's crucial to the success of the project. And then you get into the nuts and bolts of the delivery. So then Agile works very well, we find, for e-commerce B2B, particularly delivery, because the ceremonies around Agile are highly collaborative. So you're looking at, it's a daily stand-up between project teams. So it's a go-to meeting, it's a WebEx. Everyone is running around each team talking about what they did today, or what they did yesterday, what they're going to do today, and what's hindering their progress. And it's not just our team, we ask that of you as well, because there's just so many inputs when you come to e-commerce, be it stock, be it catalog files, understanding the web services. There's a lot of collaboration, and that gets back to dedication then. Sprint planning and reviews. So we operate 2-week sprints, which again works very well from a visibility perspective. So, and it works well from the ability to adapt and change. So every 2 weeks, we get together, both project teams, to plan out the sprint. Usually ahead of that, you know what's going into the sprint, so you're very much just prioritizing in what order it should be worked on. At the end of each sprint, there's a review. So that brings to the visibility of progress. Every 2 weeks, it is important that you see what's going on. A solution implementer can't dive into a hole for 6 to 9 months with absolutely no communication and come back up again and show you something that you didn't necessarily have an expectation of what you're going to be delivered. So every 2 weeks, having a visibility of the progress, seeing in real life the platform being built and built and built, and getting to a point where you reach the minimum viable product, or getting to the point where you've achieved everything that you want for the first drop. And again, it's a crucial part to it. Next piece is quality, particularly for B2B, because they are business critical systems. Quality is absolutely crucial. So escape defects, you need to reduce escape defects as much as possible. You need to reduce downtime as much as possible. Again, Unifier being a great example. If you're taking 3,000 orders a day and there's downtime, or there's an escape defect, or there's a bug in production, that's a huge problem. So from a quality perspective, we practice test-driven development, which means that we're thinking about how do we test the feature before we even develop the feature. And this is something that is important, but it does add to the cost of the project. So in effect, you're paying more for quality, but then as a result, you have a better quality product that's going to market. On the data quality piece and integration testing, you probably know that there's a lot of junk data in your back-end systems, be they ERP systems or warehouse management systems. Traditionally, without e-commerce being put to the forefront for a user, traditionally that's all hidden to your staff. Once you hook up your back-end systems to a production environment that users can access, there's a lot of crappy data there that will need some level of sanitization. So from a data quality perspective, you want to get a post-production environment set up. You want to hook up your production systems and actually see what shape the data is in. You probably have a sandbox for an ERP or staging for an ERP, and that's where all the development integration is done. But in terms of real data, you need to get to grips with what kind of data is there. Third piece is functional testing and automating functional testing. Again, to minimize downtime, when building new features, you need to carry out some level of regression testing. So if you've built checkout, it's in production, it's working perfectly, then there's a new feature to add something to checkout, you need to regression test checkout and all the features within it. So this can be a time-consuming task the bigger the platform gets. So, and traditionally e-commerce platforms are quite large. So for Unifier, for example, it could take 3 to 4 days to run a full regression test on the entire platform, because there's 1,000 user stories, there are so many features, so many edge cases, so many tests. So to be certain on the quality of code that you're pushing to production to minimize escape defects, you need some level of automated testing. Otherwise, you'll spend days regression testing for each release. So for how we handle automated testing, you won't be able to create a test for everything. And that's, once you come to terms with that, then you're looking at creating tests for the critical business features. And then it's a case of every time you build, every time you push a new feature, you automatically trigger the tests, and maybe something will fall out, and it goes back to development, and it means it's not an escape defect. Nor does it take 3 days to regression test. So again, pretty important when you're dealing with the business critical system. Seventh area I'd look at would be scale and performance. It's a different type of scale than traditional B2C. So we have B2C platforms that can handle 30,000 concurrent users, for example, at peak. For B2B, the scale is different because it's usually heavy load coming up to cutoff time to get an order in for next day delivery, for example. So when you design for scale, you need to, there's a few areas. One will be the application itself. So Magento Magento Enterprise is a highly scalable platform. And Mark can go into more detail on how you can use some of the native features of Magento. The second area then is actual server infrastructure. So you need to build out your server infrastructure in such a way that it can elastically expand when you reach peak and maybe contract as traffic reduces. So then it's a case of, well, what's your traffic profile like? You need to look and analyze what your traffic profile is and how your users interact with the system. A couple of good examples. A company we worked with are effectively they're in the gift card business, a B2B gift card business. Very little traffic January to November or January to October, and then November, December is insane traffic. So in that example, there's no point them paying for servers to be there all of the time on the basis that there might be traffic when they know that there won't. So they're able to expand and contract their infrastructure as traffic peaks and troughs. The second one I'd look at would be redundancy and disaster recovery. All servers are going to crash at a certain point in time. So once you come to terms with that, then you realize you need a disaster recovery plan. And then it's a case of it's balancing the risk, of an outage and the lost revenue potentially of an outage versus the cost of a DR plan and the ability to flick the switch when you realize that, the data center is down, the UPS hasn't kicked in, the backup generators hasn't kicked in, and you're now offline. It's fine, you can flick a switch. So it's only 10 minutes of downtime instead of 2 hours of downtime. So disaster recovery is something that you need to take pretty seriously. And any hosting company that you're looking to strike a deal with in terms of server infrastructure, you need to talk to them about what's the disaster recovery plan, how often do they practice that plan, is it once a year, and then how you also orchestrate that with back-end systems. Performance monitoring is actually a key part now of the Magento cloud stack. There's some great tools on performance monitoring, but effectively this is keeping track on a day-by-day basis and an hour-by-hour basis on the performance of the application in production. Paul mentioned earlier the SAP patch that they applied that badly affected invoices before Christmas. This is a perfect example of where performance monitoring would have kicked in there. Not all changes are going to be on Magento. It's a highly integrated system, so changes can happen on connecting systems that we, from a solution partner perspective, wouldn't be aware of. So the ability to monitor performance and monitor peaks and troughs in performance, and then once you see some red lines coming out that there's the slow load on a certain page, you're immediately troubleshooting it before the customer call center starts getting flooded. So it's active monitoring of performance. Finally, on the measure and grow piece, the Agile mantra is to release early and release often. The longer a project goes on, the more risk there is associated with it. So from our perspective, we never want a project to go any longer than 8 to 12 sprints is our typical project life cycle. You don't want a project going longer than 12 sprints, which is 24 months. Or at least you don't want a version of the platform that you're building to go longer than that. So this is back to adapting to change, back to iterating. Building out a platform, releasing it, getting in front of customers, getting real life feedback from your customers will impact what the next features you'll want to add to the platform will be. So by releasing early, you're able to get it in front of customers and actually get real life feedback. And then it also de-risks it because you're putting it in front of the customers and you understand that yes, there is uptake or no, there's not uptake. And then you can pivot straight away if needed. The longer it goes on, the longer you're waiting for that magic moment when you put it in front of the customer. And they might not like what they see unless you've done the research, unless you've tested the interfaces, and unless you really know the customer. Secondly, tracking and measuring success. From my perspective, I always look at, I usually wouldn't really do anything unless I could measure it. You want to see what the baseline is of something. You want to change that thing, and then you want to measure it again to see, has it made an improvement? Is there a measurable impact? Is there cause and effect of what you've just done? Otherwise, you're just doing stuff and it might or might not be working. And you really have no visibility on it. So the ability to track and measure success is key. And we build it in as part of the speccing of the project. That how do you actually measure this feature that you're building? Finally, back to evolving and iterating. And Guy put it very well when he said it's not a case of build it and then that's it, it's done, and walk away. By constantly evolving the platform, you can, with small tweaks even, you can incrementally change and improve conversion rates, average order value, increase onboarding. So you're not going to get it right in the first go. You need to constantly just keep at it, and you'll see the return on investment come. That's it. Thanks very much for listening. If there's any questions, it's a short, sharp masterclass on B2B, but it's from my perspective, particularly based on project retrospectives. These are kind of key. This is key feedback from real life customers. Cool. Cheers.